It is time to welcome you back, guys, to another one of my videos. Now this time I'm not really reviewing an episode of a TV series as per the usual. I'm not theorizing on a TV series as per the usual, but instead I'm reviewing the new Netflix movie, comic book based Netflix movie, otherwise titled The Old Guard. Now this movie is based on the Image Comics publication with the same title, The Old Guard. To be more specific, it's based on the first volume of said publication, which was titled Opening Fire and was published in 2017. Okay, so the movie starts with the narration by Andy, very true to the comics. That's the first thing you read on the pages of the comics. Even the words are pretty identical. I've been here before, too many times to count, over and over again, and each time the same question, is this it? Will this be the time? And each time, the same answer. It's a double-edged sword when you're this true to the comic book material. I mean, on one hand, your inner nerd is excited, it's already giggling and happy to watch the comic book come to life. But on the other hand, you're thinking, okay, I know what's coming up next. There's no mystery to all of it. Now, in that context, I definitely give this movie an 8 out of 10 because you gotta love it both ways. There are certain changes that does make you go, okay, there's a little bit of a change here, there's a little bit of a mystery, don't know exactly how this is gonna go down, but there's also the part where you know how certain things went down in the comics where you can see that this is going down the same way, you can see the beautiful Easter eggs. But Andy, though, she's giving us an idea about who they are and what they want. You know, they're fed up with life, they've lived so long, and they're tired of it. And for one simple reason, these people have lost everyone that they love. They have, in some cases, loved different people over and over again, only to lose them. And it's getting tiring. It's getting tiring for all of them. Now, the beginning of the story on the pages of the source material is set in Barcelona rather than Morocco. The very first meet that we read about on the pages of the comics does happen in a coffee shop in Barcelona. Not the first time they've met, but the first time we see them meet. And it's all four of them, not just Booker meeting her on the street, informing her about this. Now, there is no separation over there. There's no talk about that 1 year that she took as a break, so that's not part of the comics. Her statement to Booker, we don't do repeats, it's too risky, that's also right out of the source material. The bit about her picking the phone out of those girls, you know, deleting that picture, that photo in which she appeared in the background, and then taking a photo of them, that's not out of the comics, but it is representative of her mentality. You know, we need to hide in plain sight. No one needs to notice us. If people would notice us, they would notice that we never age, that we always exist, and that would pretty much reveal our secret. That also goes towards the whole we don't do repeats, it's too risky, and goes as well towards her hatred of this digital age. Like, she talks about that in the movie as well, but she does talk about it in the comic. You know, it's too hard to hide in this day and age, with the internet, this level of technology, and the whole world becoming this one small place. But there's the whole talk about Copley, you know, convincing her that we're going to be doing good. That's what leads her to go. She does know there are kids involved in the whole thing before she goes, and that's why she agrees. She meets Copley, he tells her the same thing. A lot of the statements that he makes there are taken and replicated right out of the comic books. Now, the meeting in the comics happens in Paris instead of, once again, Morocco. They have this talk, you know, she's the leader, you can tell that from the beginning, so she's the one who has to make the decision. The same talk goes down, you know, the talk about kids having been abducted, that's what leverages her into accepting this mission. A lot of the conversation over there is a replica out of the same conversation on the pages of the comics, including, but not limited to, the part about invoicing him after it's all done. But moving on to the mission though, I mean, almost everything, once again, is an exact replica, from the helicopter dropping out of it at a distance, walking a little bit of a distance, arriving at night, getting in, the place not seemingly being heavily guarded, going in, realizing there's really no one in there until the lights come up and they get attacked, you know, they get killed. So yeah, this is the first part. These people have been killed so many times, have been dead so many times, but they always heal and they always come back to life. So it's not the immortal in the sense that they can be killed. They could be killed, but they don't stay dead. But that doesn't answer, though, the question that she asks at the beginning, you know, is this it? Well, the case happens to be they die, they heal, they get back up, they die, they heal, they get back up. until one time they die, they don't heal, and hence they don't get back up. So the healing factor is the whole thing here. At some point it's gonna stop, at some point it has stopped for people before them, other immortals that Andy has met over her very long life, a little bit over 6,000 years in the comics. But yeah though, getting back up, mutilating their attackers, that axe that Andy sports, it's an exact replica as well out of the comics. Very excited to see that. There's the realization that there are no girls, maybe they were moved. No, they weren't. We were set up. Copley was lying. Copley, you son of a bitch. Those are the words when she sees the camera on the pages of the comics. But okay, we move then to Nile in Afghanistan, the Marine. Now most of this is once again replicated out of the pages of the comics, like an exact replica, all the conversations, all the statements. He hurt some of our people and hurt some of yours. They talk about being respectful, it doesn't hurt to repeat it. All of that is taken right out of the comics. The entire situation is once again an exact replica. Now, as we get to know, if we haven't read the comic before, Nile is also one of the immortals. She's not one of the team of 4. She's gonna be the 5th that gets added to them later on in the events of the movie. But let us though stick to the chronological order of events of the movie. So yeah, she does get attacked at that moment as well on the pages of the comics. She does end up dead, or thought dead, but then she ends up healing, just like she does over here on the movie. Once again, everything that happens here is an exact replica. The woman that points them in the right direction, getting those shots fired, moving in, killing the guy or shooting the guy slitting her throat. That's exactly out of the source material. But let us though talk about that dream that Andy has. Now Andy has a dream of Nile. She knows her last name is Freeman. She knows that she is a Marine, and she does go on the search for her after that. The dream's exactly by the comic, and it happens to be explained in the same way as well. They don't always dream of one another, but when there's someone new, another immortal out there who dies for the first time, the already existing immortals would get a dream of that person, dream of them, know that they're out there in order to unite with them, because that's how they get together, that's how they find one another. Beyond that point, if they lose one, not know where he is, that does not happen, that does not repeat, they don't just keep dreaming each other up. But anyway though, the bit about Nile herself dreaming the rest of the team up, that's not part of the comic books, that does not happen over there. It doesn't really change the story by much, or at all for that matter, but it is not part of the source material. But post the dream though, the next thing here is Andy's statement about it having been 200 years, like 200 years since the last immortal was found. The last one that joined the team does happen to be Booker. Booker is originally French. He's a counterfeiter, originally a counterfeiter, but also one who ended up forced into joining Napoleon's Grand Army that invaded Russia. And of course we know that army got defeated. There were a lot of deserters or people attempting to desert, and he was one of them, and the man ended up hanged in the Russian cold. That's where he discovered, or when he discovered, that he was an immortal. But here's another variation, and if you notice, a lot of variations are happening with Booker on the movie. Like the first time Andy meets any of them on the movie, it happens to be Booker and not all of them like in the comics. The one who argues against the retrieval of the new girl of Nile is actually Booker, when it's actually Andy in the comics. I think the objective here is to kind of Easter egg what happens in the comics. Booker is the one who betrayed them to Copley. Booker wanted to die so badly, so he basically sold himself and them out to both Copley and in turn Merrick. He wants them to discover a way to allow them to take this away from them, their immortality, to allow them to die. But in the end, it's always been Andy that goes for the retrieval. It's always been Andy that tells them to meet her in Paris, in the Charlie safe house. And it's always been Andy that meets the girl first, that meets Nile first. But okay, on the pages of the comics, it's really Nile who asks the questions. Not even a Scar explained that Sergeant Freeman. She's talking to herself at that moment. Still love though that little touch, the boxes from Merrick, telling you what Merrick is. He's in the pharma industry. We do see that on the very next scene. He is a billionaire, he's a big shot, and he owns this pharma company. This is why, and even though the introduction is a little bit different here, he is the villain, and this is also why he wants to get those immortals. He wants to advance medicine. Not for the love of medicine or the love of people. He wants to do that. He wants to give people the possibility of immortality, because that's potentially going to line up his pockets with even more cash. Gotta love the irony over there, you know, how the movie gets him talking about loving to hate Big Pharma, but then he ends up being the villain. He ends up being a guy all about the profit, the bottom line, and he doesn't really care much about the people that he's serving with his own medicine and his own products. But once again though, the movie is trying to raise the stakes. I mean, in the comics, Merrick just asks for one of them. You know, bring me just one of them, the woman will do. But over here though, he's the one pushing for more than one, not just the one, I want them all. But okay, Andy meets Nile. She introduces herself as Andromache the Scythian, telling us why she's the leader. She's lived for millennia. I mean, we've talked about Booker, we've talked about Andy, and then later on we get to know that the other two, they met during the Crusades. And both of them, Joe and Nikki, discovered as well that they wouldn't die during the Crusades. So yeah, while these people have lived for centuries, Andy is the oldest. Andy is the one who's lived for millennia. Now Nile's attempt to escape out of a moving vehicle, Andy shooting her, that's true to the comics, except Andy did not really shoot her because she escaped. Andy shot her after having this discussion, like Nile does not believe her on the pages of the comics, you know, that she's died, she's come back, that she is an immortal. So Andy decides, okay, you know what, I'm gonna shoot her, I'm gonna prove to her that she is immortal. The comment about it being so goddamn slow the first couple of times, that's also true to the comics. That's a comment she makes, but she also makes it to Nile, like explains it to her. Now while we are at it, there are two factors that are made clear in the pacing of the healing process, you know, the speed of the process. So the first factor is, how many times have you died? The more you die, the more you heal, the faster it becomes. And the second factor happens to be about the size and magnitude of the injury, which does as well make perfect sense. But another thing though, the stabbing over here, it's a replacement for Andy actually shooting herself, like to prove to Nile that what she's saying is real. Another kind of proof. The whole ordeal on the flight to France, that did not really happen on the pages of the comics. You know, by the time she's on the plane, she's rather asking questions rather than trying to fight it, rather than doubting it, trying to prove it isn't true. They talk about having family going AWOL, that's all out of the comics as well. So yeah, we're going by the book so far, for the majority of it. But alright though, here comes a little bit of a big difference. By the time they get to Paris, only one remains. The other two have been abducted by both Copley and Merrick. Booker, being the betrayer, is left behind with a shot to the head, and he does think at first that he's dead. But the magnitude of the injury, the factor I spoke of earlier, that's the case there. It is what's slowing his healing, making them think that he's dead. Both Andy and Nile, that is. Now, the dream with Quynh never really happened on the pages of the comics. That was not true. There was a relay of the story of Noriko. It was brief, very short really, but we get more of it in the future issues, like Beyond Opening Fire, which is the focus of this movie, even though the post-credit scene on this one is pretty much all about Noriko, all about Quynh in this case, because that's the name the movie gave her. Now on the pages of the comics, Andy did meet Noriko, like spent 2 millennia running with her, just like she met another guy through the years, through the millennia. The guy was named Lykon. He is mentioned on this movie. We do actually get a flashback of the guy later on in the events of the movie, and he's kind of representative of 2 characters and not just one. He's representative of both Lykon and this other guy that she loved, and that was also in recent history, like in terms of her age, that's considered in recent history. Now on the pages of the comics, the only one out of this group who never met Noriko happens to be Booker. Of course, we're automatically also excluding Nile here, but he hasn't met her because she's been gone, as indicated here, for 500 years, and he's only been around for 200. Now the details that we read about on the pages of the comics are a little bit different when it comes to Noriko, aka Quynh on the movie. The entire witchcraft situation, all of that stuff, that didn't happen on the pages of the comics. It was just a turbulent sea moment, and she would end up on the bottom of the ocean, that's all. But the thing that was supposed to happen before the arrival of Andy and Nile to Paris, that just happened. You know, after relaying all the stories to Nile about those old immortals, the ones that passed away. So Joe and Nikki have been abducted, Booker looks like he's dead for good, but it is the other factor that I discussed before that's impacting him at this point. The magnitude of the injury or wound. I don't want to call it a wound because that shit ends up healing so quickly. The relaying of the story, the talk about this injury being an improvement, all of that stuff, once again, is copied right out of the comics. The conversation between Booker and Andy over there is almost an exact replica. But yeah though, the entire fight sequence with Andy against those guys, that's out of the comics as well. The whole comedic scene with the signal, wait for the signal, how can he even tell? Isn't that a signal? Like, there are shots fired out there, we need to help her. And he keeps going, no, we need to wait for the signal, until that explosion. And she goes, oh. For the majority of it, this comedic moment as well is right out of the comic book. The conversation in the truck between Joe and the mercenary as well, those lines that sound like poetry, all of that is out of the comic, an exact replica actually. The same does apply for them mutilating every soldier, every mercenary in the back of that truck. The first meeting with Merrick as well, that's true to the comics, the repeated stabbing at Joe. But however, though the doctor working for Merrick, the one responsible for handling all of this, in the comics is a he, and his name is Dr. Ivan, instead of Dr. Kozak over here. But that again does not really change the core story that we've got going on for us. But yeah though, in the comic book as well, Copley does have a little bit, not a full, change of heart at that point, with the repeated stabbing. The sadism as he summarizes it as opposed to the comic book where there's an entire conversation between him and Merrick after all the stabbing. But let's switch to the non-abducted part of the team, talk about some similarities between what happened on the pages of the comics and some differences as well. So one of the biggest variations over here is about Andy not healing as quickly as she is supposed to. That's not true to the comics. That never happened over there. The part about Booker telling Nile about his family and his story, that's true to the comics, but not in this situation. I mean, it was kind of instructed or requested by Andy. She did want Nile to know how much danger she would be putting her family in, and she did want her to know the story of Booker. Because that story, as you did listen and watch, does tell her about more reasons why she shouldn't get in contact with them, like more important reasons. You want to remember them as good as you remember them right now. You want to remember them as the people who loved you rather than the people who wanted something from you, who ended up hating you and making you remember them in the worst image because they always thought you held back the gift that you've got. Because they never really realized that you are unique amongst them and that you couldn't give them your immortality even if you wanted. It is as touching on the pages of the comics as it is touching on the movie, and the words used to relay the story, they're almost exactly the same. But we've got that situation in that little mart, that girl helping Andy. That didn't happen in the comics because Andy did not get an injury on the pages of the comics that didn't heal right away. But the thing I loved about this touch, this edition, is the pay it forward style. They talk about Malta as well in the lab between Nikki and Joe. That's right out of the comic book. We should go there. Yeah, we should. It was a beautiful time. The conversation about family between Andy and Nile, forgetting what they look like. The fact that they expand on this because Nile has the opportunity to always remember them. She's got a photo. That's something that was not available a couple centuries ago, let alone millennia ago. But I do think as well that this Image Comics movie is playing a little bit of game of, hey, we're gonna give a nod to Marvel movies, because that bit about getting them back, it's like the bit from Avengers Endgame. The whatever it takes does match right there. Not surprisingly as well, that conversation, that little bit of a statement is not out of the comics. You can see a little bit of Tony Stark and Andy, because Andy over here is immortal, or supposedly immortal, but she's currently about to risk it all. She thinks she could die out of this, even though she doesn't by the end of the movie. But alright, the bit about Copley, the place outside London, that's not the case in the comics. Like, the location is completely different. His offices over there, I believe, are supposed to be in Dubai. I think so, not really sure at the moment. But that, though, was it, if I remember correctly. Gonna be checking it before I post this video. We get to the betrayal of Booker, which was foreshadowed more on the movie than it was in the comics, as I did mention early on this video. We also get to meet Copley. Copley is made into more of a human on the movie than in the comics, because that story about his wife, that was not part of the source material. Booker's reasoning, though, it is one other thing that remains true to the comics. He wanted to end all of this. Isn't this what you wanted to? These are words that he did say on the pages of the comics. The one thing that's different over here is that Andy is not healing. That never happened on the pages of the comics. That's the part that I mentioned early on as well. In the comics, Merrick has got nothing with that scene, with that moment. In the comics, they're in a tower. That's actually something that's kind of Easter egged at the beginning of the movie with the plane and Annie's statement, we can jump and still survive, because they do jump off a skyscraper and they do still survive on the pages of the source material, when they're trying to escape Copley after attacking him in his offices. So yeah, their capture, all of that stuff, it never actually happened. They'd go from here to attacking Merrick to rescuing their friends. Now, I don't really mind at all the changes from the comics, as long as they're not huge or they still get us to the same ending. But this one, I do understand even more, because the writer of the script of this movie happens to be the writer of the comic book. Nile did have a lot of growth on the pages of the comics, but she's getting a lot more room to have a lot more growth over here. Copley was just a secondary character, one that was not all that important, one that felt like an asshole, and that's it, and only for moments, the moments that we see him. He even does sell Merrick at the end in that case, but only to fly away, to escape the wrath of this group. But instead though, and over here, he's given more depth. I mean, he does have a deeper story, one that is interesting. The death of his wife, he's not as bad as he is in the comics. This is no justification of what he did, but still, it's better than just doing it to line his pockets with money. But they've made Nile over here into a one-woman army, even if momentarily, until she reunited with the rest of the team, got them out of there, and started the real big fight, the real big bang. And that's exactly what happens on the comics, like the team reunites, except on the other side of that door, it was Andy, Booker, and Nile coming in heavy in order to save the other two. But hey though, you gotta love how they're all taking shots for Andy. That was one of my favorite moments on this movie. Again, not part of the comics, but it was really the welcome change over there. Now the wait for the signal bit closer to the end of the movie, is this gonna be like your last signal? Again, this is out of the comic book, one of the funnier and comedic moments in the comic book, and I liked how they mimicked and copied it for the purpose of the movie. I do like how they tied up Nile showing up and then Andy gradually losing her immortality. That was really good. Adding one member to the team, kind of giving us a member that's still new to all of this, still remembering the days when she used to hurt and feel pain, and then giving us the other one just starting to feel the pain. After all those years that she lived without being hurt at all those millennia actually. But in all cases though, in the end, we do get that jump of the building. And I love that moment. That was one of the best moments. Because yes, we missed it with Copley and whatnot, but we did get it in the end with Merrick. And that was worth it, seeing Merrick die this way. Merrick's the villain on the pages of the comics, the major villain, and he's been portrayed on the pages of the source material as an asshole, but watching him die being shot at in his bathtub, that's one thing, and watching him free fall on the movie was a completely different thing. I'm actually glad they saved that moment for Merrick for the end of the movie, as opposed to an escape route for 3 of the team members during their attack on Copley's offices. But that scene, the conversation about how's it going in there, they're still deciding, it's not like they can kill me. All of that stuff on the pages of the comics does not really happen in London, in the UK, but rather actually happens in Malta. But there's gotta be a price 100 years from now we meet you here. That was the way it was in the comics, because Annie was not really losing her healing. In this case, it's 100 years from now they meet you here. That's the price that you've gotta pay. And Booker does accept. He's planning to live as well. The movie did make it a little bit more comic as well. Nile was gonna let you off with an apology. That bit was not in the comic book. And there's also that other part, the touching part, because Andy was so serious at that moment, was talking about killing him if he weren't one of them. In this case, she's talking about missing him. She's really nice about it. That's really the beauty of making some changes for live action. You do make it more heartfelt that way. And I definitely loved that about the movie version. But the final scene with Copley though, before, what you could call a post-credit scene or a stinger scene, we do know that's not out of the comics, but it was really interesting, paved the way to another part for this movie, a sequel to the movie, and I think it's possible there are other issues out there. I've actually decided to extend my reading of old guard comics after watching the movie, so I read those other issues as well. The older ones I read like 2 years ago, but these ones are still fresh. The story over here though happens to be all about vengeance. Noriko, or Quynh in this case, does believe that these guys sold her out. Andy in specific did sell her out. Like she didn't look for her, she didn't get her back, and now she's out for vengeance. So we've got a second part of this movie, a possible sequel that is, and that sequel would involve one immortal against all those other immortals. But there is one thing we can all rest assured of. Noriko is not someone they're going to be able to mess with easily, especially with the situation with Andy. I mean, Andy is the most experienced, but Noriko, out of all these guys, she's second to her in that list. And she's got all the anger and all the rage in the world, just bringing her back with a vengeance. We're gonna watch that on the sequel, if we ever get a sequel, and I do hope we get one, because this movie really knocked it out of the park. But that said though, my work here is done, so let me know in the comments down below what you thought of the movie. Let me know if you do want to see an Old Guard 2, and let me know if you did like this video by dropping it one of those much appreciated likes, subscribing to this channel, and make sure while you're at it to enable notifications in order to get updates whenever I upload a new video, publish a new community post, or start a new live stream. But until the next time that you tune in for another one of my videos, thank you so much for tuning in to this review. Stay safe and have a great day.